just get your hors d'oeuvres. Hors d'oeuvres, which must be obeyed at all times without question.
In 2020, one of the most famous sitcom episodes ever made suddenly vanished. This was not an obscure failed comedy. This was Fawlty Towers, the British sitcom many fans still call one of the greatest ever made. Only 12 episodes were produced. 12. Yet, those 12 episodes created Basil Fawlty, one of television's most explosive comic characters. They turned a tiny fictional hotel into a comedy landmark. One episode made broadcasters nervous. Critics argue, fans defend the past, and John Cleese fire back in public. That episode was called The Germans. For years, people treated it as a masterpiece of farce. Basil gets hit on the head, German guests arrive. He gives himself one simple instruction: do not mention the war. Then, of course, he mentions it again and again. To many viewers, the joke was obvious. Basil was the fool. Basil was the problem. Basil was exposing his own ignorance in the most humiliating way possible. But decades later, the same scene looked very different to others. The question was whether it had gone too far. So, why did this episode disappear? What does the controversy reveal about comedy, censorship, and the strange afterlife of classic television? This is the story of the Fawlty Towers episode they tried to erase. Part 1. Before the controversy, there was a hotel. Not the fictional hotel with its angry owner, confused staff, broken service, and unlucky guests. The real hotel was the Gleneagles Hotel in Torquay. In 1970, John Cleese and other members of Monty Python stayed there while filming nearby. Most of the Python team reportedly hated the place so much that they left. Cleese stayed longer, not because the hotel was pleasant, but because the man running it was unbelievable. His name was Donald Sinclair. He was suspicious, blunt, rude, unpredictable, and strangely hostile toward the people paying to stay there. To an ordinary guest, that sounds like a nightmare. To John Cleese, it was material. Sinclair treated basic customer service like an enemy attack. He reportedly criticized guests for how they ate, became suspicious of luggage, and turned ordinary interactions into moments of social discomfort. Cleese saw the comic contradiction immediately. A hotel owner has one job: make guests feel welcome. But what if the owner secretly despises guests? That idea became Basil Fawlty. Basil was not just an angry man behind a reception desk. He was a social climber trapped inside a business that required him to serve people. He wanted to impress the upper classes, yet barely hid his contempt for anyone who inconvenienced him. He wanted respect, but behaved disgracefully. He wanted control, but created chaos. He wanted to seem civilized, but every crisis revealed the panic, snobbery, and cruelty underneath. That is why Fawlty Towers worked. It did not simply put a rude man in a hotel. It built an entire comedy machine around contradiction. The hotel was supposed to be calm. Basil made it violent. The staff were supposed to help. Basil made them terrified. The guests were supposed to relax. Basil made them regret checking in. Every episode began with something small and almost manageable: a difficult guest, a misplaced order, a health inspector, a rat, a corpse. Then Basil would do the one thing guaranteed to make it worse. He lied. He shouted. He panicked. He insulted someone he needed to impress. He blamed Manuel. He hid the truth from Sybil. And slowly, the episode became a trap Basil had built for himself. This matters because it explains the controversy. The episode was not built around a calm, reasonable man making a thoughtful joke. It was built around Basil Fawlty losing control. Part 2. When the Germans begins, Basil is already unstable. But this time, The writers make him physically unstable too. He suffers a head injury, refuses proper rest, and continues running the hotel while clearly concussed. This is the perfect farce setup. Farce needs pressure, a character who thinks he can handle everything, and one small rule that becomes impossible to obey. In this episode, the rule is simple. Do not mention the war. The moment Basil says it, the audience knows what will happen. He will mention the war. The only question is how badly, how loudly, and how many times. Place a character beside the one thing he must avoid, then watch his personality drag him toward it. Basil does not want to offend the German guests. He wants to appear polite, professional, modern, and civilized. But Basil is never as civilized as he thinks. His mind is panicked. His mouth is faster than his judgment. His arrogance is untouched. So he gives instructions to the staff. Do not mention the war. Then he says it again. And again. The joke escalates because Basil is not escaping the subject. He is circling it like a moth around a flame. This is why many people defended the episode for decades. The joke was not, German people are funny. The joke was, Basil Fawlty is so stupid that even his attempt at politeness becomes offensive. He is the target. He is the punchline. The German guests are not ridiculous. Basil is ridiculous. They are mostly calm, reasonable people trapped in his disaster. That is the structure defenders have always argued. But comedy is not frozen in time. A joke can be written one way, understood one way, remembered another way, and judged differently later. And the Germans contained more than Basil's famous war panic. It also contained language and attitudes from another character that became harder for modern broadcasters to defend. Major Gowan, the elderly resident of the hotel, represents a fading old Briton. He is confused, out of touch, and casually prejudiced in ways the show presents as outdated. In one scene, he uses racist language while talking about cricket. That line became a major reason the episode faced renewed scrutiny. Defenders argued that the Major was being mocked as a relic. Critics argued that the presence of the language still mattered, regardless of intention. One side believed they were protecting satire. The other believed they were protecting viewers from material that no longer belonged on mainstream platforms without warning or context. That is how a 1970s sitcom episode became a battlefield decades later. Part 3. In June 2020, The Germans was removed from UK TV's streaming service. The timing mattered. Across television, film, and streaming, companies were reviewing older shows. Some episodes were edited, warned, or removed as broadcasters reconsidered racism, stereotypes, slurs, blackface, and jokes that had aged badly. Into that atmosphere came Fawlty Towers. But Fawlty Towers was sacred comedy territory. So, when the Germans disappeared, people noticed immediately. For fans, it felt like cultural vandalism. For critics, it looked like accountability. If they left the episode up with no warning, they could be accused of ignoring harmful language. If they removed it, they could be accused of censorship and misunderstanding satire. Cleese was furious. To him, removing the episode proved decision-makers did not understand the joke. Basil was being mocked. The Major was being mocked. The ignorance was the subject of the comedy, not the message of the comedy. That distinction became the center of the argument. When a stupid character says something stupid, is the show endorsing it or exposing it? In Fawlty Towers, Basil almost always destroys himself. The show rarely lets him win. His arrogance leads to humiliation. His lies collapse. His cruelty backfires. That is why many writers and comedians defended the episode. They saw satire being punished by people who took the wrong characters seriously. But the other side had a question too. Even if the writers meant to mock racism or ignorance, does the audience always understand that? That is why this debate keeps returning whenever old comedy meets modern platforms. Television has changed. In the 1970s, viewers watched inside a shared cultural context. Today, anyone can stream decades-old comedy without that background or knowing who the joke is aimed at. Context used to come built into the broadcast. Now it often needs to be added. That is why the episode was later reinstated with a warning. Not erased forever. Not destroyed. But reframed. The episode did not vanish because it was forgotten. It vanished because people were no longer sure how to handle it. That is why this story matters for anyone who loves old television. The argument was never only about one joke. It was about who gets to control the memory of a classic. Fans wanted the episode preserved because it represented the sharpest version of Fawlty Towers. Broadcasters wanted distance because the platform had changed. Critics wanted context because language carries weight. Cleese wanted the satire understood because, in his view, the target had always been Basil's ignorance. Each side was reacting to a different fear: losing history, normalizing harm, flattening comedy, or misunderstanding art. And that is why the removal became bigger than the removal itself. It forced audiences to look again at something they thought they already understood. A familiar sitcom suddenly became evidence in a modern argument about taste, memory, responsibility, and freedom. That is rare. Most old television is either cherished quietly or forgotten quietly. The Germans refused both fates. It returned as a question mark. That is why one removed episode became a headline, a symbol, and a test of how far nostalgia should go before honesty finally interrupts the applause and asks viewers to laugh, think, remember, and argue at once today. Part 4. The most famous moment is Basil's goose-stepping scene. Cleese uses his whole body like a weapon of embarrassment. His limbs become too long, too sharp, too uncontrolled. He plays Basil as a malfunctioning machine. That is why the scene became iconic. Basil is not powerful in that moment. He is pathetic. He thinks he is managing the situation, but he is destroying it second by second. Guests watch in disbelief, staff watch in horror. Basil's social mask collapses. It is not subtle. Its comedy was fast, loud, precise, and brutal. But beneath the shouting, the writing was carefully engineered. The episode gives Basil a head injury because it creates permission for his filter to fail. It gives him German guests because it creates a forbidden subject. It gives him one repeated instruction because repetition builds anticipation. Do not mention the war. Every time that phrase returns, it becomes funnier and more dangerous. The audience knows Basil is doomed. That is, comedy suspense. Not suspense about a bomb, but about a man avoiding the one thing he must not say. And because the character is Basil, the answer is obviously no. He cannot avoid it. He cannot save himself. He cannot be normal. That is the secret of the scene. It is not random offensiveness. It is character-driven escalation. Dangerous comedy depends on precision. The audience has to know where the joke is pointed. If the arrow seems to point at the wrong target, the scene changes. For some viewers, the arrow still points at Basil. For others, the imagery and language became too loaded to separate from the joke. That disagreement is why The Germans remains both celebrated and criticized. It is a masterpiece to some, a mistake to others, and to many people, both at once. Brilliantly written, historically important, and impossible to watch today without hearing the argument around it. That is a strange kind of immortality. Most sitcom episodes fade because nobody cares anymore. The Germans survived because people care too much. Part 5. But here is the twist. The Germans did not end Fawlty Towers. The show was not canceled because of that episode. It was not dragged off air in disgrace. Fawlty Towers ended because John Cleese and Connie Booth chose not to keep going. They had made 2 series, 12 episodes, and one of the tightest sitcoms ever written. Then they stopped before the formula became tired. Most shows stay too long. They repeat themselves, soften characters, chase ratings, replace cast members, and lose the sharpness people loved. Fawlty Towers never had time to decay. There is no long bad era. No desperate final season. No slow collapse. Just 12 episodes of escalating disaster. That short run made every episode feel important, and every controversy bigger. When there are only 12 episodes, removing one means removing a significant piece of the whole show. That is why The Germans matters so much. It is not just one installment in a massive catalog. It is 1/12 of the entire series. Take it away, and the shape of Fawlty Towers changes. You are not trimming excess. You are cutting into the body. This is why fans reacted so strongly. To them, removal was not a minor platform decision. It was an attack on a masterpiece. But the controversy also revealed something uncomfortable about nostalgia. People often remember classic television as simpler, safer, and more innocent. Then they rewatch it and discover it was sharper, meaner, stranger, and more politically loaded. Fawlty Towers was never gentle. Basil was cruel. Sybil was vicious. Manuel was bullied. The guests were insulted. The whole show ran on embarrassment, class anxiety, xenophobia, snobbery, panic, and humiliation. It was funny because it was dangerous. Part 6. What made Fawlty Towers special was not that it avoided offense. It was that it used offense to reveal character. Basil's rudeness told us who he was. His snobbery revealed what he feared. His cruelty toward Manuel showed his cowardice, because Basil punched down when he could not punch up. That is why the show still fascinates writers. Every joke grows from character. Basil does not say terrible things for cheap shock. He says them because he is Basil Fawlty, insecure, desperate, arrogant, terrified, and socially trapped. He wants to run a respectable hotel while behaving like a man who should never meet customers. He wants to appear superior, but every episode proves he is ridiculous. That is a strong comic engine. A weak sitcom depends on jokes anyone could say. A strong sitcom builds jokes only that character could create. The Germans works because only Basil could turn politeness into catastrophe. Only Basil could prepare himself not to offend guests and then offend them more spectacularly than anyone else in the building. Only Basil could believe, even for a second, that he might still recover. That is why John Cleese defended the episode so strongly. For him, it followed a clear comic principle: mock the fool, not the victim. But creators cannot control every interpretation. Audiences change. Platforms change. Cultural memory changes. A line that once passed quickly can become the only thing people talk about. A satirical scene can be clipped, shared, separated from context, and judged alone. That is the modern problem. The episode remains the same. The world around it does not. Part 7. Trying to erase. The Germans only made it more famous. Before removal, many knew the scene. After removal, everyone wanted to know why it had disappeared. That is how censorship debates work. The forbidden object becomes magnetic. People search for it, argue, defend, condemn, clip, repost, and turn it into a symbol larger than the work. The Germans became more than an episode. It became evidence. To some, evidence that modern culture had become too sensitive. To others, evidence that old entertainment carried attitudes people had ignored for too long. To writers, evidence that satire can be misunderstood when the frame changes. And to fans, evidence that Fawlty Towers still has the power to start a fight. That may be the real legacy. Not that the episode was erased. It was not. Not that the show was destroyed. It was not. But that 1/2 hour of comedy still forces people to ask serious questions. Who is the joke about? Who gets hurt? Who decides what stays available? And can a comedy scene be both brilliant and troubling? The answer may be yes. It is not comfortable television. It is anxious, angry television about people failing to hide the worst parts of themselves. Basil Fawlty is funny because he is exposed. He wants dignity and loses it. He wants authority and becomes childish. He wants superiority and reveals emptiness. He wants to control the room and becomes the disaster everyone remembers. Conclusion: because the German sits at the exact point where classic comedy becomes modern controversy. It is brilliantly performed, historically important, and undeniably uncomfortable. It shows how satire works when everyone understands the target, and how vulnerable satire becomes when context fades. John Cleese believed the episode mocked ignorance. Many fans agreed. Critics and broadcasters worried about the language, imagery, and impact. Fawlty Towers was never safe comedy. It was a pressure cooker. A tiny hotel full of class panic, bad manners, prejudice, fear, rage, and humiliation. Basil Fawlty was not a hero. He was not a role model. He was not the voice of reason. He was the warning sign behind the reception desk. A man who believed he was better than everyone else while constantly proving he was worse. That is why the episode still matters. Not because it ended Fawlty Towers. Not because it was erased forever. Not because one scene destroyed the show. But because it reveals the strange power of great comedy. Sometimes it embarrasses us. Sometimes it exposes things we would rather forget. Sometimes it survives long enough to be judged by a world that laughs differently. When that happens, we can bury it, blindly defend it, or do something harder, watch it honestly. We can understand what it meant then, what it means now, and why people fight over it. The Germans was not the episode that killed Fawlty Towers. It was the episode that proved Fawlty Towers was still alive. Nearly 50 years later, Basil is still marching through that lobby, still failing to control himself, still making audiences laugh, wince, and argue. The hotel closed long ago. But the argument never checked out.